The air in the courtroom was thick and stale, smelling of old wood, lemon-scented polish, and despair. It was a smell I'd become all too familiar with over the past 6 months. I sat beside my father, my hand resting on his bony shoulder. He was 70 years old, and in his cheap, ill-fitting suit, he looked every day of it, and then some. This was the final hearing, the last act in the slow, public unraveling of a good man's life. My father, Arthur Green, was a contractor, an honest one, a fact that had become his greatest liability. When a massive recession hit, the big developers he worked for folded one by one, taking his payments with them. He'd taken out loans to pay his own crews, to keep the lights on, believing the money was coming. It never did. The bank, a soulless entity named Granite Peak Financial, was now here to pick the carcass clean. The bank has been more than patient, Your Honor, their lawyer, a sleek young man in a suit that cost more than my car, said with a practiced tone of regret. Mr. Green's debts are substantial and undisputed. We've provided exhaustive documentation. We are seeking summary judgment and the subsequent liquidation of all remaining assets to satisfy a fraction of the outstanding debt. My father flinched beside me. Those assets were his tools, his truck, and the small, modest house he'd built with his own hands 30 years ago, where my mother had passed away. It wasn't just property. It was his history, his soul. Our court-appointed lawyer, a weary-looking woman with a stack of files, stood up. Your Honor, Mr. Green is a victim of circumstance. He's a man of integrity who was caught in a systemic collapse. We ask for leniency for a payment plan. A payment plan based on what? Counsel. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, interjected. The defendant is unemployed and, by all accounts, unemployable in his current field. His age is a factor. There is no discernible income. I'll find work, my father whispered, his voice cracking. It was a hollow promise, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge's gaze was not unkind, but it was relentlessly pragmatic. Mr. Green, the law is clear. The debt is valid. Sympathy does not pay creditors. She picked up her gavel. I find in favor of the plaintiff. A lien will be placed on the property, and the listed assets will be seized for auction. It was over. The final nail. My father slumped forward, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, hopeless sobs. The sound tore something open inside me. I was 24. I had nothing to my name but a business degree I hadn't known what to do with, a stack of my own student debt, and a bartending job that kept me afloat. I had been powerless to stop this slow-motion train wreck. But as I watched that banker, a Mr. Sterling, allow himself a faint, satisfied smirk as he gathered his papers, something in me snapped. It wasn't anger. It was colder, sharper. It was certainty. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly in the quiet room. Your Honor, my voice was louder than I intended, echoing in the high-ceilinged chamber. The judge paused, her gavel still poised. Everyone turned to look at me. My father looked up, his eyes wide with panic and confusion. Young man, this proceeding is concluded. The judge said, her brow furrowed. I know, Your Honor. I have something to say. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked directly at Mr. Sterling. Let my father go. Wipe his debt. Sterling let out a short, derisive laugh. And why will we do that? Who are you? I ignored him, keeping my eyes on the judge. I will get you back on your feet. I will pay you back. Every single cent. The silence that followed was profound. And then it broke. It started with a snicker from the bank's legal team. Then, the few observers in the gallery began to chuckle. Mr. Sterling didn't laugh. He smiled, a thin, condescending curl of his lips. It was the most insulting sound I had ever heard. The judge did not laugh, but her expression was one of profound pity. Son, she said gently, as if speaking to a child, that's a noble sentiment. But the court deals in realities, not fantasies. Do you have $1 million I'm unaware of? No, Your Honor, I said, my face burning with a mixture of shame and defiance. Then I suggest you sit down. But I didn't. I looked at Sterling, my gaze unwavering. You think I'm a joke. I get it. But remember this day. Remember you had a chance to be merciful. And remember that I told you I would pay it back. I turned to the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. I helped my trembling father to his feet and guided him out of the courtroom. The sound of their laughter, now fading behind the heavy wooden door, didn't humiliate me. It fueled me. It was the spark in the darkness. They had seen a foolish boy making an impossible promise. But I had just made a vow, not to them, but to myself. And I had nothing left to lose. The drive home was a journey through silence. My father stared out the passenger window, his face a mask of utter defeat. The occasional tremor that ran through his hands was the only sign of the storm raging inside him. I didn't try to fill the quiet with empty platitudes. There were no words that could glue the pieces of his life back together. The shame of his failure, magnified by my public outburst, was a weight pressing him down into the seat. We pulled up to the house, his house, for a few more weeks at most. It was a modest two-story home with a porch that needed painting and a garden my mother had once tended that was now overgrown. It wasn't just a structure. It was a living scrapbook of our family. Every scuff on the floor, every crack in the driveway, held a memory. Now, it was a corpse waiting for the undertaker from the bank to arrive. He walked inside, his shoulders slumped, and went straight to the worn armchair in the living room, the one that had been his throne for as long as I could remember. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat, staring at the cold, empty fireplace. I went to the kitchen and made 2 cups of strong, black coffee. When I handed one to him, his hands were so unsteady the liquid sloshed over the rim. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered, his voice ragged. You shouldn't have said those things. They'll just think you're a fool." "Let them," I said, my voice low and steady. He looked at me, then really looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain so deep I could barely hold his gaze. $1,000,000, Alex. It's impossible. You have your own life, your own debts. Don't chain yourself to my ruin." He didn't understand. This wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about the smirk on Sterling's face. It was about the sound of that gavel. It was about the sight of my father, the man who had taught me to swing a hammer and to always look a man in the eye when I shook his hand, being broken down to nothing. Later that evening, after I'd managed to get him to eat a few bites of food, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but I had a cold feeling in my gut. I answered. "Alex Green." It was a smooth, familiar voice. "Mr. Sterling, what do you want?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "I've been thinking about your passionate speech in court today," he said, his tone laced with amusement. It was quite the performance. It got me wondering, what was your plan exactly? "A bake sale." I said nothing, letting his condescension hang in the air. "Look," he continued, the faux friendly tone evaporating. "I'll be frank. The bank is going to take the house. We're going to auction the assets. The debt will be written off as a loss. It's over. But your little stunt today, while entertaining, creates a potential narrative problem. We prefer our debtors to go quietly." "I'm not your debtor," I stated. "Semantics," he dismissed. "Here's my offer. A fool's offer for a fool's promise. You sign a document, right now, formally renouncing your ridiculous claim that you will repay this debt. You acknowledge it was an emotional outburst with no basis in reality. In return, I will personally see to it that your father is allowed to keep his personal vehicle. A small act of mercy. He'll need it, I assume, for job interviews that will never come." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was offering a pittance, a crumb of dignity, in exchange for my surrender. He wanted me to put in writing that I was the fool he believed me to be. He wanted to own not just my father's past, but my future resolve. I could feel the pressure to say yes. It was the logical, sane thing to do. It would give my father one less thing to worry about. It would end this. But then I saw it again, that smirk in the courtroom. I heard the laughter. "No," I said, the words simple and final. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I don't think you understand the generosity." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my voice cold. "The answer is no. I'm not signing anything. My offer stands." Sterling actually laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You're even more delusional than I thought. Very well. Enjoy the foreclosure notice. And when you're living in that car I so generously offered, Remember this conversation. The line went dead. I stood in the dim hallway, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange, clean clarity. I had just burned the last bridge of compromise. There was no way out now, but through. I had a business degree I'd never used, a bartender's salary, and a mountain of debt that now had a name, Granite Peak Financial. I walked back into the living room. My father was asleep in his chair, exhaustion having finally overtaken grief. I looked at him, at this good, honest man who had been failed by the system he believed in. They had laughed at my offer. They thought it was the desperate cry of a fool. But they were wrong. It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration of war. And I had just fired the first shot. The foreclosure notice came. As promised, a stark official document taped to the front door like a death certificate. We had 30 days. The clock was ticking, not just on my father's home, but on my soul. The weight of my promise, which had felt like a defiant flame in the courtroom, now threatened to crush me under its impossible reality. I kept my bartending job. It was cash in hand, and I needed every dollar. But the late nights and the smell of stale beer began to feel like a sentence. I served drinks to financiers and lawyers who reminded me of Sterling, their conversations about mergers and acquisitions a bitter soundtrack to my own financial ruin. Every tip I pocketed was a microscopic grain of sand against the mountain of debt. My father was a ghost. He moved through the house, packing boxes with a slow, mournful reverence, handling every item as if it were a holy relic. A chipped mug from a family vacation, my mother's favorite vase. Each object was a memory, and each box sealed away was a little death. He stopped talking about finding work. The fight had gone out of him. His spirit had been broken in that courtroom more decisively than his finances. I, on the other hand, was burning up with a frantic, directionless energy. I spent my days off at the library, surrounded by textbooks I hadn't opened since graduation. Macroeconomics, corporate finance. The words swam on the page, theoretical and useless. How did you turn theory into $1 million in months? You didn't. It was a mathematical impossibility. I looked at startups, at business plans, at stock market charts. It was all noise. I had no capital, no investors, no brilliant, unique idea. I was just a kid with a grudge and a business degree that felt like a participation trophy. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in the garage, surrounded by the artifacts of my father's trade. This was where the seizure would hit hardest. His tools were meticulously organized on pegboards. Every wrench, every saw, every level. They weren't just tools. They were an extension of his hands, the instruments of his integrity. The auctioneers would come and sell them for pennies on the dollar to strangers who would never understand the care with which he maintained them. I ran my hand over the table saw, its cast iron surface cool and smooth. This was his legacy, not the debt, not the failure. This, the ability to look at a pile of raw lumber and see a house, to create something solid and lasting from nothing. And that's when the first fragile idea sparked. It wasn't a grand business plan. It was a memory. I remember being 12, following him around a job site. He wasn't just building a house. He was solving 1,000 tiny puzzles. The client, a demanding older woman, had wanted a built-in bookshelf in a weird, angled corner. The foreman had said it couldn't be done, that it would be too expensive to custom cut. My father had stared at the space for 10 minutes, then took some measurements, sketched on a scrap of wood, and spent the afternoon crafting a perfect, seamless unit. The woman had been so thrilled she'd cried. He hadn't charged her extra. The job is to solve the problem. Alex, he'd told me. Not just to follow the plan. Solve the problem. I looked at his tools, and I didn't see auction fodder. I saw the solution, but not for construction. The construction industry was attuned for him now. I thought about the people I served at the bar. The young couples complaining about the nightmare of finding a contractor for small jobs. The homeowners tearing their hair out over a leaking faucet or a deck that needed staining. The endless complaints about contractors who didn't show up, who overcharged, who did shoddy work. The problem wasn't a lack of work. The problem was a lack of trust. My father's name, Arthur Green, was now mud in the business world. It was synonymous with failure. But his skill, his integrity, that was still real. It was just buried under the ashes of his reputation. I couldn't use his name. I couldn't get a business loan. I had no money for advertising. But I had a phone. I had a bartending job that put me in front of dozens of people every night. And I had a father, broken but not useless, sitting in a dark living room. That night, I went to work with a new purpose. I listened more intently. When a regular, Mrs. Gable, complained about her rotten porch steps, I didn't just offer sympathy. My associate could take a look at that for you, I said, my heart hammering. He's very good, very discreet. He does small jobs, cash, just to cover materials and his time. No markup. Mrs. Gable looked skeptical. Everyone says they're good. Who is he? He's off the grid. Doesn't advertise. But I can vouch for him. If you're not happy, you don't pay a dime. It was a reckless, desperate offer. But it was an offer. She agreed, hesitantly. I went home that night and didn't tell my father about the foreclosure notice. I didn't talk about the debt. I found him in his chair, staring at the wall. "Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "I need your help." He looked up, his eyes dull. "Mrs. Gable, down on Elm, has rotten porch steps. It's a safety hazard. I told her I knew someone who could fix it. I need you to come with me tomorrow and look at it." He blinked. "Alex, I can't." "I'm not." "You're not what?" I pressed, my voice harder than I intended. "You're not a carpenter anymore?" "Since when?" He gestured vaguely, a helpless motion that took in the whole doomed house. "After all this, who would trust me?" "No one," I said bluntly, and I saw him flinch. "They won't trust Arthur Green. They don't need to know it's you. They just need to trust the work. So, will you come and look at the steps?" He held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw a tiny, guttering spark of something in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but pride, a craftsman's pride being challenged. Finally, he gave a slow, single nod. "All right, I'll look at the steps." It wasn't a victory. It was a single, shaky step out of the ashes. But it was a start. We were no longer Arthur Green and Son. We were a ghost and a bartender with a bag of tools and a secret. It was all we had. The next morning, I practically had to drag my father from his chair. The spark of pride I'd seen the night before had been smothered by the grim reality of daylight and the packed boxes that now lined the hallway. He moved with the heavy reluctance of a man walking to his own execution. "This is a mistake, Alex," he muttered, sliding into the passenger seat of his old truck, the one the bank had, for now, overlooked. "What am I even doing? I can't take money from some little old lady." "You're not taking it," I said, starting the engine. "You're earning it. And it's not a charity case. Her steps are a lawsuit waiting to happen. You're providing a service." He fell silent, staring out the window at the familiar streets that now felt foreign and hostile. Mrs. Gable's house was a quaint, older cottage with a porch that was indeed sagging ominously on one side. The steps were soft with rot, a clear danger. She came to the door, peering at us with a mixture of hope and deep suspicion. "Mrs. Gable, this is my associate," I said, using the term I decided on. I didn't offer a name. My father, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. He gave her a small, polite nod, his professional instincts momentarily overriding his despair. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but steady. He walked over to the porch, his eyes automatically scanning, assessing. He knelt down, poked at the wood with a key from his pocket, and traced the line of the structure. I held my breath. This was the moment. Would he retreat back into his shell, or would the craftsman emerge? He stood up and turned to Mrs. Gable. "The stringers are completely gone on this side. It's not a repair. It's a full replacement. The posts are sound, though. I can have new steps built and installed by the end of the week. Pressure-treated lumber, sealed and painted to match." His voice was different now, authoritative, knowledgeable. It was the voice of the man I remembered. Mrs. Gable looked from him to me. "And the cost?" My father started to open his mouth, probably to lowball it out of shame, but I cut in. "We'll do it for the cost of materials, plus $200 for the labor." It was a pittance, less than a tenth of what a licensed, insured company would charge. My father shot me a look, but I held his gaze. This wasn't about the money. Not this money. This was about the proof. Mrs. Gable's face broke into a relieved smile. "Really? That's wonderful. Yes, please. When can you start?" "We'll go get the lumber now," I said. The next 3 days were a transformation. We worked out of his garage, which was still, for a little while longer, his. The air, which had been thick with the smell of defeat, was now filled with the familiar, honest sense of sawdust and fresh-cut pine. The whine of the table saw, which I had feared would be a sound of mourning, became a song of purpose. My father was in his element. He measured, he cut, he assembled. His hands, which had trembled holding a coffee cup, were rock steady as they guided a board through the saw. He didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. The language was in the work, the precise joints, the perfectly level treads, the smooth, sanded surfaces. I was his grunt, fetching tools, holding boards, learning again. It was the first time in months I felt we were on the same side of an unbreakable wall. On Friday, we loaded the finished steps onto the truck and drove to Mrs. Gable's. Installing them was a 2-hour job. When we were done, they were solid, level, and perfectly matched. They looked like they had always been there. Mrs. Gable came out to inspect. She walked up and down them, testing each step with deliberate care. Then she turned to us, her eyes welling up. "They're perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what a relief this is. I've been terrified to let my grandchildren visit." She pressed the cash into my hand, the exact amount we'd agreed on. Then, she handed my father a paper plate covered in foil. "I made you some brownies. For your trouble." My father looked down at the plate, then back at her face. A complex series of emotions played across his features: shame, gratitude, and a dawning, fragile sense of worth. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice soft. "It was my pleasure." It was the truest thing he'd said in a year. As we drove away, he was silent for a long time, staring at the plate of brownies on his lap. The air in the truck was different. The weight was still there, but it had shifted. "That was good work," he said finally, almost to himself. It was, I agreed. He looked over at me. $200. "It's nothing, Alex. A drop in the ocean." "It's not nothing," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's the first drop." I pulled out the cash and separated it. I handed him the $200. "For you. For your time." He stared at the money in his hand, as if he'd never seen currency before. It wasn't a payment from a faceless corporation. It was a token of gratitude from a satisfied client. It was validation. He didn't put it in his pocket. He just held it, a small, crumpled testament to the fact that Arthur Green, the man, was not yet obsolete. We had our first client. We had our first payment. The ghost had done good work. And for the first time since the gavel fell, I saw a flicker of something in my father's eyes that wasn't despair. It was the quiet, stubborn ember of a craftsman whose work, at least, had not been broken. The $200 was a pebble thrown into a still pond. The ripples, at first, were small and local. Mrs. Gable didn't just have a new set of steps. She had a story. And in a neighborhood of older homes and fixed incomes, her story was a precious commodity. She told her bridge club about the mysterious, skilled carpenter her bartender had found. She told the ladies at her book club. She told her neighbor, whose fence was falling down, and her son, who was struggling to assemble a new crib. The rumor began as a whisper. "There's a man. He doesn't advertise. He's cheap, but his work is impeccable. You have to go through the boy at the Oakwood bar." My father continued to work in a state of quiet shock. The work was a balm, a familiar ritual that slowly began to rebuild the shattered pieces of his confidence. He still woke in the night. I could hear him pacing, the weight of the looming foreclosure a constant shadow. But during the day, in the garage, with a tape measure in his hand and a problem to solve, he was present. He was Arthur Green, master carpenter, not Arthur Green, financial failure. Meanwhile, at the bar, my role shifted. I was no longer just the guy who poured drinks. I became a gatekeeper. A harried-looking man would slide onto a stool, order a beer, and then lean in. "Hey, I hear you know a guy. My gutters are pulling away from the house." A young couple would linger after paying their tab. "Our kitchen cabinets are falling off the wall. We got a quote for $5,000. We just don't have it." Mrs. Gable said you might know someone. I became adept at the discreet conversation. I'd take a name, a number, a brief description of the job. I never promised anything. I'd say, "I'll see if he's available." He's very selective. This only added to the mystique. I was building a brand on scarcity and word of mouth, a brand with no name. The jobs were small, but they were constant. A leaky faucet here, a tile backsplash there, a deck needing to be restained. My father's skill was so far beyond the scope of these tasks that he performed minor miracles with an effortless grace. For a widow whose disposal was broken, he not only fixed it, but also quietly tightened all the loose cabinet handles and oiled the squeaky hinge on her back door. He didn't charge extra. It was just who he was. The money started to add up. Not the $1,000,000. Not even close. But it was a trickle that became a steady stream. We operated on a strict cash basis. I handled all the client interactions and the finances. I paid my father a fair wage for his labor, far more than he would have given himself. The rest, every single dollar, went into a locked metal box I kept under my bed. The granite peak box. I was obsessively meticulous, keeping a ledger of every cent earned and every expense. It was a game of numerical make-believe, but it was the only game we had. The work was our secret, our rebellion. When the official notice of the auction date arrived, giving us 3 weeks, my father didn't crumble. He read it, his face grim, then folded it neatly and placed it on the kitchen table. He looked at me. "We've got that built-in bookshelf to finish for the young couple on Maple," was all he said. The rumor was no longer a whisper. It was a distinct hum in our part of the city. We were no longer just fixing porch steps. We were building custom shelving units, repairing antique furniture, doing small-scale renovations that other contractors couldn't be bothered with or quoted exorbitantly. My father's genius for solving unique, spatial problems was becoming our unique selling point. And then, the roar started. It began with a local online community board. A post titled, "Looking for the Ghost Carpenter?" It had hundreds of comments. People were sharing their experiences. He fixed my sagging porch roof in an afternoon for a fraction of what I was quoted. He built my daughter a window seat that looks like it came with the house. He's a miracle worker. How do I find him? The mystery had captured people's imaginations. They didn't know his name, his face, or his story. They only knew his work. And his work was legendary. I stood behind the bar, reading the thread on my phone, my heart pounding. This was what we needed. This was leverage. But it was also exposure. The wrong person could connect the dots. A new client came in that night. A man in a sharp suit who didn't look like he belonged in a neighborhood bar. He ordered scotch, neat. "I understand you're the man to see," he said, his voice low. "I have a rather delicate project. A complete library restoration in a historic home on Crestview Ridge." Crestview Ridge was the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. This was a different league. The structural beams are compromised, and the previous contractors have botched the repairs. It requires a specific, almost lost craft. I've heard stories about your associate abilities with complex woodworking. I felt a thrill of fear and excitement. This was big, the kind of job that could put a serious dent in the debt. "I can have him take a look," I said, keeping my voice neutral. But his schedule is filling up. The man slid a business card across the bar. It was elegant, embossed. He was a personal assistant to a very wealthy, very private family. "Have him call this number. The budget is flexible. Quality is the only objective." He left. I held the card, the thick, expensive stock feeling alien in my hand. The ghost had been summoned by the kings of the hill. The rumor had become a roar, and it was echoing in places I never thought we'd reach. We were still 3 weeks from losing everything, but for the first time, the impossible promise I'd made in that courtroom didn't feel like a lie. It felt like a destination, and we were finally, truly, on our way. The Crestview Ridge estate was a world away from the modest homes we were used to. It was a sprawling, century-old Tudor revival, hidden behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. The library was less a room and more a cathedral of knowledge, with 20-foot ceilings, dark oak paneling, and a series of massive, sagging beams that threatened the entire structure. My father walked in, his old tool bag in hand, and fell silent. He didn't see the opulence, he saw the problem. He ran a hand over the splintered, cracked wood, his eyes tracing the lines of the failed, ugly steel supports a previous contractor had bolted in as a desperate fix. "The joinery is original," he murmured, more to himself than to the impeccably dressed estate manager. mortise and tenon. They try to force it with metal. It's fighting itself. He spent an hour taking measurements, sketching in a small notepad, his focus absolute. The manager, a man named Mr. Albright, watched him, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to intrigue. Finally, my father turned to him. I can fix it. I'll have to craft new beams to match the profile and install them using a modified French scarf joint. It will be invisible when I'm done. The steel has to go. And the cost? Albright asked. My father looked at me. This was beyond our usual materials plus labor quote. This was a professional restoration. I took a steadying breath. $25,000. Half up front for the specialized lumber and milling, half upon completion. It was an astronomical sum to us. A fortune. It was also probably a fraction of what other firms would have charged. Albright didn't even blink. Agreed. We require discretion and speed. The advance payment, $12,500 in cash, felt like a brick in my hands. I added it to the granite peak box. The total was now a little over $60,000. A staggering amount earned in a few short months, yet still a mere 6% of the mountain we had to climb. The auction was in 10 days. We worked day and night in the garage, which had become our sanctuary and our factory. The scent of expensive, old-growth oak replaced the pine. My father was an artist, meticulously shaping the new beams, recreating the ancient joinery with a reverence that was almost religious. I was his apprentice, learning, assisting, watching a master at work. The day before the auction, we installed the beams. It was a ballet of precision and brute force. When the final beam slid into place with a solid, satisfying thud, locking the entire structure together without a single nail or bolt visible, it was a moment of profound silence. The library felt whole again, safe and eternal. Mr. Albright inspected the work, running his hand over the seamless, solid wood. He handed me the second half of the payment without a word. That night, the granite peak box held $87,000. It was everything we had. It was a king's ransom earned one broken step and one perfect beam at a time. And it wasn't enough. We were still over $900,000 short. The morning of the auction dawned gray and cold. The foreclosure notice was a final verdict on the kitchen table. My father dressed in his same cheap suit. He was calm, resigned. The work had given him back his dignity, but it couldn't stop the inevitable. "We tried, son," he said, his voice thick. "You did more than anyone could have asked. I'm proud of you." The words were a blessing and a eulogy. We drove to the courthouse steps, where the auction was to be held. A small, grim crowd had gathered. Lawyers, bankers, a few curious onlookers, and people like us, there to witness the end of their dreams. I saw Mr. Sterling standing with his colleagues, looking smug and bored. He saw me and gave a condescending little wave. The auctioneer began. "First lot, the property at 1814 Maple Drive, sold." The gavel fell. One after another, lives were liquidated. Then it was our turn. Next, the assets of Arthur Green. We have a truck, a collection of tools, and the primary residence. My father closed his eyes. The bidding started low. A pittance for the truck, a few hundred for the tools. I felt sick. Then they opened the bidding on the house, and I stepped forward. "I have an offer," I said, my voice clear and loud, cutting through the auctioneer's chant. Sterling rolled his eyes. "Not this again." The auctioneer frowned. "This is a cash auction, son." "I have cash," I said. I walked forward and placed the heavy metal box on the clerk's table. I opened the lid. The stacks of bundled cash, the result of 1,000 small acts of integrity, lay inside. A murmur went through the crowd. $87,000, I announced. For the house. The auctioneer was taken aback. Sterling laughed. "The debt is over $1 million. That's not a serious offer." "It's an offer on the property," I insisted, my heart hammering. "The bank can accept it or continue the auction." It was a stunt, a desperate, theatrical stunt. I knew they wouldn't accept, but I had to try. I had to show them we had fought. Just as the auctioneer was about to dismiss me, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Mr. Albright got out, followed by an elderly man in an impeccably tailored overcoat. I recognized him from the society pages. Lawrence Van Horn, the owner of the Crestview estate. Van Horn walked straight to the auctioneer, ignoring everyone else. "I would like to place a bid," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. Sterling looked confused. "On which property, sir?" Van Horn pointed at my father. "On that man's house. I bid $1,200,000. The world stopped. The air vanished from my lungs. Sterling's jaw went slack. I don't understand," the auctioneer stammered. Van Horn turned and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Green, the work you did in my library, it was not merely repair. It was art. My grandfather built that room. You saved a piece of my soul." He then turned his steely gaze to Sterling. "The bank's total claim, with penalties, is $1,187,000, is it not? My bid clears the debt. The remainder," he said, looking back at my father, "is for you, for a fresh start." The impossible had happened. The gavel fell. The house was sold, but it wasn't lost. It was redeemed. Sterling stood frozen, his face a pale mask of utter disbelief. The laughter in that courtroom had been silenced forever. My father looked at me, tears streaming down his face, not of grief, but of a deliverance he had never dared to imagine. I had promised to get the bank back on its feet. I hadn't. I had found something better. I had restored my father's name, and in doing so, I had summoned a miracle. The ghost carpenter was a ghost no more. He was Arthur Green again, and he was coming home.